Hi guys, and welcome to the War Story podcast. Quick note, if you're listening for the first time, the audio quality will get better very shortly as soon as I've done this introduction. I'm not hooked up to my microphone, etc., but I wanted to get this episode out today. It's in the wee small hours, so forgive me if I sound tired. I'm sure, like a lot of you guys listening, been a busy few days with Remembrance Day, Remembrance Sunday, all that kind of side of things. I just want to say a couple of things about that, actually, before we get into the episodes. Please bear with me. The first thing is, I just want to say it's been great to see people posting on social media to say that this year they have found, after a few years of struggling with Remembrance Weekend, that they've had a positive experience this year. If you're one of those people, then I'm extremely proud of you. There's a chance if you're listening to this podcast, we've met at some point or we're friends, and I know some of you listening are the people that I'm talking about here. So I just want to say I'm really proud of you. And if you're someone who did struggle this weekend, I want you to know that things can get better. Things do get better. You have to just keep on going. I know it sounds so trite to say that, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. Keep going. If you need to speak to someone, please do speak to someone. There's always someone out there, be that a comrade that you served with, a friend on social media you might never have met in your life. Speak to someone, a charity. I know it's difficult. I've been there myself. I know it is. But people want to help. For everything that we see in the news and all that stuff telling us about how much we hate each other, apparently, there's a lot of kindness in the world, guys. And sometimes you have to put your hand up and so for people, know that you're in trouble, but people do care. People want to help. So if you're going through it, if it's been a tough weekend for you, which I'm sure it probably has for some of us, keep going, guys, and keep going and talk to people, because people want to help. On the subject of remembrance, guys, that's really what this podcast is all about. It's why I started it. It's why I keep it going. I've always said if it was just me listening, then we'd still keep the podcast going. Thankfully, it's not. There's a lot of you who come here for every episode, and I'm very much grateful to you, because one of those reasons why I feel a lot better in myself these days is because I feel I have a purpose now, and a lot of that purpose is remembrance, and you guys make that possible. So thank you. I really do appreciate it. I feel a lot better place these days, and that's only possible because of the support that you guys have given me and continue to give me. So thank you. And on the subject of remembrance again, the whole point of this podcast is we're especially kind of digging down into the war stories of, I was going to say our generation. I have no idea how old you are. You might be twice my age, might be half my age. God forbid, a quarter of my age. But the whole point is that we're recording these stories for future generations and hopefully helping people out in the present too. And unfortunately, there are many campaigns that we want to remember where the people who took part in them are no longer with us, but we need to remember them. And where that is the case with this podcast, then we're going to start having guests on who are experts in not only the campaigns that took place in the past, but experts in the people who were involved with them. Because I don't know about you guys, I couldn't give a shit about maps and markers and all that kind of stuff. I want to know about the people. That's why war's so terrible. War's so terrible because it affects people. So we're going to have historians on who really kind of concentrate on that side of history. It's great to know the big picture of these battles, but without knowing the stories and the people involved, then really, why does it matter? And so I'm very grateful to that end to be joined today by, when I say expert on the expert, I mean expert. His name's Mr. Dilip Sarkar. He's an author, historian, and expert on the Battle of Britain. He was also, as he'll say himself, incredibly lucky to meet so many men and women who took part in the Battle of Britain in their various roles. And as such, I just couldn't think of a better person to kind of come on today, talk to us about what the Battle of Britain was, why it was so important, like why Britain really shouldn't have stood a chance. But there was a little chance, there was that slight chance, and somehow, some way, Britain came out victorious. And of course, they only did so because of the sacrifices and the efforts of so many people. And Dilip is very passionate about remembering those people. We all are too. So I think this was just a great marriage for the perfect guest to have on the podcast. If you are interested in ever becoming a guest on the podcast, if you would like to come on and talk about your own experiences, all the information on how to do that is down in the show notes. You can find more information about all of Dilip's projects, which are legion, down in the notes as well. So yeah, guys, just to wrap up before we get into today's episode, there's not going to be an outro to this. So I just give you the usual ask. If you found something valuable in today's episode, which I'm sure you will, please share it. It's the only way we can grow. And again, if you're out there struggling, you're not alone. You're never alone. Reach out to somebody, friend, stranger, us, whoever, but reach out and talk. All right, guys, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Dilip Sarkar. Dilip, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for giving your time this evening.
No trouble at all. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to getting into this subject. Actually went to, I should have asked you before we start recording, I went to a talk the other day about the Battle of Britain given by Black, as he goes by.
Black Robertson,
yeah.
Great friend of mine, Air Marshal. He comes round here and I said, Black Art, you sound more like a pirate than an Air Marshal. Very good friend of mine.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, it's one of those things, to my shame, the Battle of Britain is something that I feel I'd love to know more about, and I'm sure a lot of other people kind of feel the same way. So with that in mind, can you just give us, take us in whatever direction you want to take it, about how we got to the Battle of Britain and why it was so important?
Okay, so the Battle of Britain, if it wasn't for Fighter Command prevailing in the Battle of Britain, there wouldn't have been any other battles. And I really don't think people understand that. There wouldn't have been a Battle of the Atlantic, there wouldn't have been a strategic bombing offensive, there wouldn't have been a D-Day, there wouldn't have been a liberation of Europe, there wouldn't have been anything. Because Britain was the last free Western democracy. And therefore, the only base remaining in Northwest Europe from which war against Hitler could continue to be prosecuted, and ultimately, with American help, the Allied liberation of enemy-occupied Europe eventually launched on the 6th of June 1944. So if Britain had fallen in 1940, none of that would have happened. And that's how important it is. And it astonishes me that people just don't understand that. It's a pivotal moment in our history, in our modern history. It's shocking. There's been a survey done recently, and the majority of adults in this country below the age of 40 have never heard of it, which to me is just mind-blowing. I did a piece with BBC Radio Gloucester recently that then went out on, I think, something like 43 BBC stations on the local radios for the Battle of Britain 85th anniversary last month. And in the studio, the presenters were talking about it afterwards. And I don't know, one of the staff was 23, and had just never heard of it, didn't have a clue, and was making light of it as well. Now, you could argue it's not necessarily that person's fault. It's the fault of our society that does not embrace our history and and make sure that people understand the importance of the sacrifices involved and everything else. And I don't have to tell you that, because you know that full well. But we have got a problem, I think, now with all of this, that something like the Battle of Britain, to me, is so important, so crucially important, that it just cannot be allowed to be forgotten. We remember Agincourt, 1415, Trafalgar, 1805, Waterloo, 1850, and the Battle of Britain, 1940, is a lot closer to us than those events. And it is just as important.
Yeah, it's extra shocking considering that it is still within living memory to some people in our society. So I'd like to come back more onto the issue of education remembrance later on, but for now, I guess a very broad question would be: if you were a bookie in 1940 and you were looking at the German side and looking at the British side, what kind of odds would you have given us for actually pulling it off, a victory?
Zero. I mean, what happened in the spring of 1940 with Hitler's surprise attack on the West? I mean, it was a long anticipated attack on the West, but it was still a surprise when it came. And my God, they achieved complete surprise, didn't they? And when the Blitzkrieg began on the 10th of May, it was shocking, absolutely shocked the Allied command system, everything. It was incredible. And the advance to the Channel Coast, what Hitler did in 6 weeks, what nobody else had ever done. And it came as such an incredible surprise to the Germans, as much as anybody else. So when the panzers swept across northwest France, and Rommel, on the evening of the 20th of May, was stood on the French coast, looking towards Britain across the Channel, it is inconceivable. And it's also inconceivable that France fell. France, not Britain, not Germany, was actually the greatest military power in the world at that time, certainly in Europe anyway. That old institution, France, had fallen. It's unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable at that time. So suddenly Hitler is presented with an unprecedented and unanticipated opportunity to mount a seaborne invasion of Britain.
Yeah, I suppose. I'd like people now to kind of think how close 9/11 feels in history to us now in terms of the time it's passed. So that's kind of about the time we're looking between these events in 1940 and the end of the Second World War. Not far off at all, maybe even bang on. And having gone through that stalemate in the First World War, like you said, it must have just seemed just totally impossible that something like this could happen. And I suppose it's a testament that even that at that point that we were still kind of willing to go on and not negotiate given that set of circumstances. Where with the resources that we had, was there any kind of looking ahead to that we might need them to defend Britain, or were we throwing them into the Battle of France and then it was kind of a case of, right, what have we got left?
No, not at all. So basically, between the wars, the air power doctrine all revolved around the bomber, that the bomber would always get through. And the concept was born of Douhet, the Italian general, and so on, who believed that a bomber force could defeat an enemy through the bombing of its manufacturing and military capacity, and also the indiscriminate bombing of its civilian population, which would then cause chaos and even revolution, because it would provoke the civilians to rise up against their own governments for not protecting them. And that was the main focus of people's air-mindedness, if you like, because you've got to remember, it's not that many years before that the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. So aeroplanes were very new. And in the First World War, they'd originally been used for reconnaissance to replace balloons, and then the arms race escalated from there, didn't it? Taking pot shots at each other with revolvers and rifles, and then machine guns, and then dropping little hand grenades and little bombs out the aircraft. It all sort of emanated from the First World War. But during the First World War, the first bombs were dropped on this country. And that changed everything. Absolutely changed everything. And the situation you've got going forward is the Germans harnessed all of this and were able to practice in the Spanish Civil War in the mid-1930s. And there was a French city, town called Guernica, a Basque town, that was obliterated by German bombers. Now, there's an awful lot written about Guernica, but it was actually a navigation error that led to Guernica being wiped off the face of the earth. And of course, Picasso did his famous Impressionist painting of the suffering of Guernica. But what that did was make people terrified of bombing. So I remember growing up in the 1960s, and it was all about nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and still is, I suppose. But, you know, people were very afraid of it when I was growing up. There were all kinds of television programs and government sort of information programs about what to do in the event. You know, all this sort of stuff was going on. Cold War, of course. But so you know, that's how people were really, really afraid. But they really did think that the bomber was the way forward. And Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, he told the House that there was no power on earth that would save you from the bomber, and that the bomber would always get through. And Lord Trenchard, the father of the Royal Air Force, he even believed and said, and I quote, that fighters are only of any value to keep up the morale of one's own people. That's how powerful they thought bombers were. Now, fortunately, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding and his senior air staff officer at the time, who was an Air Commodore then, Keith Park, a New Zealander, they completely disagreed. And both of them had been fighter pilots in the First World War, so they knew a thing or two about air fighting. And they absolutely, doggedly, determinedly, and without any deviation from this, believed that the base had to be kept secure. And that unless the base, I mean, and this sounds so obvious, patently obvious to me, that unless the base is kept secure, the bomber baron won't be able to fight a battle in the first place. Won't be able to deliver this knockout blow that was so talked about. So they set about creating what became the absolute very best system of air defence in the world at that time. And Dowding was a technocrat. He'd previously been the air member for research and development. And in fact, he had a great deal to do with writing the specification for the tenders that went out that ultimately became the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire modern monoplane 8-gun fighters. And he far-sightedly harnessed radar into this new system. But they did that against an incredible amount of resistance, because up until 1936, it had all been about disarmament, and Britain had massively disarmed. Nobody else actually had. Nobody followed our lead. I was just reading about it earlier on, actually. Staggering. But Britain had massively disarmed, and it was only from 1936 and the first expansion plan when the RAF began expanding sufficiently to defend this country and for a war footing. And Dowding was very clear. He became Chief of Fighter Command in 1936, very clear about how many squadrons he needed to do that, and resisted any attempt to drain his squadrons away. And you were talking about France. Well, Dowding only committed Hurricanes to France, to the Allied Advanced Air Striking Force. And the reason for that was because the Hurricane, we had 2/3 more Hurricanes than we had Spitfires. And the Hurricane, was available in numbers, but it didn't have the performance of the Spitfire. Fighter combat is all about heightened surprise. And in fact, Dowding again far-sighted, because later during the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt 109's excellent aeroplane was coming in over 30,000 feet, unpressurized cockpits as well, over 30,000 feet. And it was only the Spitfire that could get up that high and take the 109s on. So without that high altitude umbrella that the Spitfire provided, it could have been a very different story. And Dowding knew this. He knew about the performance of the aircraft and what was likely to happen in terms of tactics. So it's absolutely extraordinary that he had the foresight to preserve the Spitfires for home defence. So yes, to answer your question in a very roundabout way, Dowding and Keith Park, unfortunately for the Battle of Britain, Keith Park was promoted to Air Vice Marshal and became the commander of 11 Group, which covered London and the South East. And he was the tactical victor, really, of the Battle of Britain. Dowding was the genius, the strategist behind it all. But they knew full well that they could well be called upon to defend this country. And the only way that they could do that was through air, and also because of the advances of technology and the advances of aircraft performance, the whole of the British Isles was within range of German bombers. And what that then did was put everybody in the front line. The home front was also the front line. It's an extraordinary story.
So you mentioned 11 Group there. How were we set up with all of Britain being at risk? How were we kind of set up with these different groups?
So basically, the country was divided into groups. You've got 13 Group, which is sort of Scotland and right up in the north. And then you've got 12 Group, which is the East Anglia and the Industrial Midlands and the north. And then you've got 11 Group, London and the South East. And for the Battle of Britain, 10 Group was specially created, which covered the West Country. So there's a lot of aircraft factories you see in the West Country: Filton at Bristol, Parnell at Yates, and Westlands at Yeovil, Supermarine itself at Southampton. So lots to defend down there. And the whole thing is controlled by Bentley Priory in Middlesex, which was Dowding's Fighter Command headquarters. So you have the Fighter Command operations room with all the information coming into them, and they filter it out, and it then goes down to the sector operations room. Each group has its own operations room, and then within those groups, it's divided into sectors. So you would have, for argument's sake, in 11 Group, Biggin Hill Airfield Sector, Kenley Airfield Sector, Hornchurch Airfield Sector, and the information would go into those operations rooms, and then ultimately the appropriate squadron or whatever would be scrambled to deal with whatever the threat was incoming. So it was an incredible system, and of course radar gave us this advanced warning. It couldn't tell us what the formations consisted of, but it could give you a rough idea of the size and when the Germans started building up and assembling over the Pas-de-Calais. And this is something else that's very important, because the strategy before the war was that any air attack from Germany would come across the North Sea to East Anglia, to the East Coast. So that really made 12 Group the primary group. But Hitler's unprecedented advance to the Pas-de-Calais changed everything, because it was also perceived that there wouldn't be any fighter-to-fighter combat, because the ME-109's range was insufficient to fly from Germany to Britain. So it would just be bombers, and our tactics were all written and evolved around just attacking bombers. But the advance to Pas-de-Calais changed that. It put even London within range of the Messerschmitt 109. So suddenly, Fighter Command is faced with a scenario that was unthinkable, unimaginable, and that nobody had trained for. Nobody had predicted. All the tactics, Fighter Command book of tactics just went in the bin, because it was all written about attacking unescorted bombers that were going to quite happily fly along quite sedately, not take too much evasive action, be shot down. Well, it didn't work like that at all. So it was incredible. But the groups, you see, each group maintained strength, and Dowding very cleverly rotated his squadron. So a squadron that got battered down in 11 Group or 10 Group, they would then go north to a quieter sector. So up there, the Germans are still active. They're active at night. They're active during the day with reconnaissance bombers. But there's a great deal of difference to chasing around lone reconnaissance bombers up north than coming down to Kenley or Biggin Hill or Hornchurch and fighting ME-109s. Incredible difference. So they will go up there where they could take on new pilots and give them extra training before another battered squadron would need to go north, and they would rotate, you see. So Dowding maintained a strength all over the country. And on the 15th of August 1940, that was actually, it's not celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, and nor should it be, but it was the greatest day of fighting. And there was fighting from Sunderland right the way round to St. Evell in Cornwall. It was a huge front. And the Germans, the Air Fleet Luftflotte 5 in Norway, attacked the northeast, Sunderland and Newcastle, the RAF base at Driffield, and so on. Massive attacks. And of course, they expected not to meet any British fighters, because the belief was their intelligence was really hopeless, by the way. They had the worst intelligence officer the world has ever known, who just told Reich Marshal Goering what he wanted to hear. So they believed that they were not going to meet any RAF fighters, and that all of the RAF's strength was concentrated in the southeast. Well, it wasn't. So of course they got an absolute kicking off the northeast coast, and in fact Luftflotte 5 was defeated in that single day. It took no other part in the Battle of Britain again. Single day. And Churchill himself remarked on Dowding's genius of generalship for doing that, because if Dowding had done the obvious and put all the strength down in the south, the Germans could have walked straight in up in the northeast. So it was a very clever system.
How experienced were our pilots? How many of them had been in service for a while, or are these guys, a lot of them who have been called up and given quick, a few weeks of training and sent off?
Well, again, this is quite a complicated scenario, really, because let's just talk about the Germans first, because the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was a professional air force. So there were no amateurs in the Luftwaffe. It was a totally professional air force. Plus, the Luftwaffe had fought in Spain in the mid-30s, where they worked out all their tactics and everything. And then, of course, they blitzkrieged their way from Poland on the 1st of September 1939, to Calais and Boulogne at the end of May, June 1940. So these guys are really experienced. They're the most experienced combat flyers in the world, and let's not forget that. Now, the Royal Air Force, on the other hand, what people are not going to realise very likely is that the majority of personnel were amateurs. You've got the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve that was created in 1936, and that was a very clever Trenchard initiative, whereby it was all very socially hierarchical, you have to remember. So the VR was really aimed at the grammar school boys. So they would stay in their civilian occupations, learn to fly at the weekends, and then they would form a trained reserve to be called to full-time service in the event of an emergency, which, of course, is exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. And then this was sort of based on the citizen volunteer principle, but you'd also got the Auxiliary Air Force, which is based on the territorial principle. So the auxiliaries and the Auxiliary Air Force was socially and economically elite, really was, particularly 601 Squadron, the Millionaires Mob. And these are, this is sort of public school on speed, really. A lot of them very wealthy, very well connected. A lot of these squadrons, they're all related to each other, or married to somebody's cousin, and they all know each other, and they're all very wealthy, own their own airplanes, fly for pleasure, and that's the auxiliaries. So they were locally raised. So, for example, I live in Gloucestershire. We had 501 County of Gloucester Squadron, which was raised at Filton, Bristol. 504 County and Nottingham Squadron, 609 West Riding, and so on and so forth. So you've got this big reserve of trained people, but they are amateurs at the end of the day. So when mobilisation occurred at the end of August and beginning of September 1939, the Auxiliary Air Force is called to full-time service, and so are the reservists. And the reservists are then they're posted into existing RAF squadrons or auxiliary squadrons, whatever. But the point is that at that point when war was declared, the RAF had got no combat experience and very little experience of the new modern monoplanes. Now, the Spitfire only flew for the first time in 1936, and the Hurricane shortly before that. The Spitfire had only been in service and the Hurricane for just over 2 years. Well, in fact, the Spitfire entered service 4th of August 1938, so by the time of the Battle of Britain, which started in July 1940, it actually hadn't been in service for a full 2 years. So these are very new, and these airplanes, they're very fast, they're very manoeuvrable, they've got retractable undercarriage, closed cockpits, they've got 8 machine guns. They're very different to the biplanes that the RAF had flown up to 1938. The process of replacing those biplanes wasn't a quick one. So the pilots in the Air Force, they may well have had lots of experience, hundreds of flying hours, flying Gauntlets and Hearts and Furies, biplanes, but they are not the aircraft that they're going to fly to war in. Thank God. Thank God. Because if we'd have gone to war in 1938 at the time of Munich and the crises over Czechoslovakia, the RAF's frontline fighter was a biplane, the Gloucester Gauntlet. And God help the Gloucester Gauntlet against an ME-109. So, it's this potpourri, isn't it? We're starting to see now. We've got volunteer reservists, we've got auxiliaries, we've got a very small between the wars peacetime air force, which was like a posh flying club, really. And then you've got the new technology coming in. We're trying to get to grips with all of this. The RAF's tactics are all ended up being totally wrong, the fighter tactics, because of the perfectly understandable belief that the attacks would come from Germany and it would just be bombers they'd be fighting. And of course, it didn't end up like that at all. So suddenly, the Royal Air Force has got a fantastic system of air defence organised by Dowding and Park. But tactically, they've got to learn incredibly fast. And the Germans had the massive advantage of having worked all this out in Spain in the mid-1930s. So things like the RAF formation was called a Vic, and it was basically 3 aircraft flying very close together in a Vic formation with the squadron behind it if it was in line astern. So you'd have the squadron is 12 aircraft. It's divided into 2 flights of 6, 2 sections of 3, and they will be sections line astern. And the problem with that, because the idea was that the section of 3 would be able to attack a German bomber, and if they stayed together as cohesive formation, they could bring 24 machine guns to bear rather than just the 8 of a single aircraft. And then they would attack, peel off, they'd be replaced by the section behind, and so on and so forth, you see. But the problem with this is that the pilots are concentrating on formation flying. They're not searching the sky for the enemy. Whereas the Germans, with the 109s, they're flying what's called the Schwarm, which is 4 aircraft, a section of 4, the Schwarm, in line abreast with 200 meters at least between each aircraft. So their pilots are not worried about colliding with the aircraft next to them. They're able to search the sky. And then when battle is joined, the Schwarm breaks up into the Rote, which is 2 fighting pairs, leader and wingman. The leader's job is to get the shot. The wingman's job is to protect his leader's tail, so his leader can just concentrate completely on focusing on shooting down that target. And that's still the basis of fighter combat even today, I hasten to add. So the RAF have got a lot of work to do on the job to get up to speed. So if you say, who was going to win this epic contest, if you think about the journalist William Shearer, who was in London during the Battle of Britain, and Kennedy, the politicians, and I've quoted them in the books, they just thought Hitler was going to be marching down Pall Mall within a matter of days.
Is there a date that we can kind of confidently put down for this is when the Battle of Britain began and what happened on that day?
Yeah, it's again, that's very interesting, because when Lord Dowding wrote his dispatch on the Battle of Britain, he chose the 10th of July 1940 as the start date, because the fighting was heavier on that day than it had been up to that point. And the 31st of October as the end date. Now, if his lordship was still alive today, I'd really like to have a conversation with him about all that, because it's much easier for me now, because I have access to the German records and what the Germans were thinking and what their strategy was and their intelligence documents. And, we've got the interviews with their commanders and, Kesselring and so on. Goering was, intensively interviewed at the end of the war before he committed suicide and things. So we know much more about the German intentions. Now, I would argue that if we're to understand that the Battle of Britain was fought to deny the Germans the aerial supremacy that's prerequisite to mounting a seaborne invasion, then the Battle of Britain could only have been fought once when the Germans append their air operations to a plan to invade, and end when either they are decisively defeated or they abandon that plan. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Fighting either side of that is fighting, and it's the war, but it is not the Battle of Britain. So what I know now, having just done a million words on the Battle of Britain, and a bit Battle of Britain Day, to I'm honest, what I know now is that it was on the 2nd of July when Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had made it known that the intention was to invade Britain. So there was a lull between Dunkirk, which finished at the 2nd of June, until the 19th of June, when nearly 100 German bombers roamed over mainly East Anglia at night, and London, although London wasn't attacked, but there was a bit of a lull. And then after that, it started up again on the 2nd of July, and the fighting was over the Channel between the fighters of both sides, over convoys, things like that. It increased as well over that week between the 2nd of July to the 10th. And Dowding as well must have been the 10th of July. Well, it wasn't, because it was the 2nd. It was on that day that they expressed that wish. And when did it end? Well, 17th of September, after the events of Battle of Britain Day, which was Sunday, the 15th of September, it was obvious that the Germans couldn't continue to sustain such heavy losses. And it was also obvious that the RAF was not, in fact, down to its last Spitfire and Hurricane, as the German airmen had been led to believe by their dreadfully awful intelligence people. And that, therefore, there was no way, with the changing weather, the uncertain tides, the uncertain weather, that an invasion was going to go ahead anytime soon, if indeed ever. So on the 17th of September, Hitler postponed the invasion. And he'd already dallied about making that decision. And that's another conversation we need to have, actually. And then on the 12th of October, he cancelled it completely. So I would argue that the Battle of Britain was actually 2nd of July until the 12th of October. Whatever else happened either side of that is not the Battle of Britain. But for official purposes, it will always be 10th of July to the 31st of October.
And what was the Germans' plan for winning it?
Well, now therein lies another tale. So first of all, let's just talk about Hitler's intentions. Hitler and his generals, they didn't have the experience to mount such a massive combined operation. You look at the planning that went into D-Day and the resources that went into D-Day, right? Now, the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Grosser Admiral Raeder, the naval chief, they were afraid of the Royal Navy. They knew that the Royal Navy was much, much stronger than the Kriegsmarine. And there was a lot of arguments going on between the generals and the admirals about the whole thing in the German camp. And whilst they were pretty confident that they could defeat Russia very quickly, they were not confident about Britain, far from it. And Hitler was fully aware of how hazardous a sea crossing was going to be. So Hitler's preferred strategy was actually brinkmanship, which he'd been very, very good and very, very successful at in the period of building up to the actual Second World War breaking out, over Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, the Anschluss with Austria, where he pushed everything to the brink, and then he was given what he wanted. And this is what he was trying to do, because of the reasons I've just explained. His preferred strategy against Britain was to achieve a bloodless victory. So all of this skirmishing in the Channel, it was really brinkmanship. And those formations were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But there was no total war. There was no bombing of the British mainland, no bombing of London. In fact, the bombing of London was absolutely forbidden. But what it is, it's a show of strength. It's what I call air fleet diplomacy, where Hitler, because of this fear of bombing that we talked about earlier, Hitler was trying to frighten Britain into surrendering. Now, the Danes had surrendered at the very threat of being bombed. And everybody had seen what air power had done to Warsaw and to Rotterdam. So it was a good strategy. And perhaps if not for Churchill being Prime Minister, it may have worked. But Churchill wasn't for turning and wouldn't back down. And Hitler kept on and on and on, and he kept delaying. The generals, the admirals are saying, Mein Führer, pull your finger out. You need to make a decision. What are we going to do? Because after the 15th of September, the tides are against us. The weather is against us. We have to do, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it. Got to do it properly. And of course, Goering, his deputy and Air Force chief, he's deluded anyway. And he's utterly convinced that given 4 days of good weather, he'd wipe out the Royal Air Force. Well, Goering's excuse constantly was that he hadn't had good weather. I mean, Eagle Day, the attack of the Eagles, Adler attack, that was delayed because of bad weather and ended up being a damp squib. So there's a lot going on in the German camp, and Hitler is building up with his rhetoric to the 19th of July, when he made a speech to the Reichstag and in the Sportspalast, which is his last appeal to reason. And leaflets were dropped all over Britain with this speech, where he was saying, we can stop this. It doesn't have to be any more bloodshed. Britain accepts our terms of surrender, and it's a bloodless victory. Well, there was no, and it was a big deal, this broadcast and this speech, but there was no response. Churchill said he refused to respond because he wasn't on speaking terms with Hitler, which I've always found quite amusing. But 2 days later, the War Cabinet did decide that they should respond, and the response came from Lord Halifax, who was the Foreign Secretary, and Lord Halifax had previously been a great supporter of Neville Chamberlain and appeasement. So the fact that Halifax broadcast the message that, forget it, we are not, Britain fights on, that sent out a very strong message to Hitler. So at that point, he's really got to do something. He can't back down, so he's got to let Goering get on with it. And Goering genuinely believed that his Luftwaffe could bring the Royal Air Force to its knees within a matter of days. But Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, who was our top scoring fighter pilot in the war, and my great friend, mentor, and miss him every day, died in 2001. But I remember Johnny saying to me, Dilip, the great thing in war, and many of your listeners will get this, the great thing in war is to have a plan and stick to it. And that's exactly what the Germans didn't do. Goering kept changing tack. First of all, they're attacking shipping in the Channel to frighten us. Then they start attacking radar stations and ports. And really, they never really understood the true significance of radar, else they would have made sure all of those radar stations were knocked out. Then they start attacking airfields. But they spend an awful lot of time attacking airfields that have nothing to do with fighter command because their intelligence is so poor. They're attacking bases of bomber command, coastal command particularly, even the fleet air arm. Whereas, they really should have been focused on Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, and so on. So then they start attacking the aircraft industry far too late in the day, although there are some successes. Filton, which was the biggest aircraft production plant in the world at the time, believe it or not, was really badly knocked about on the 25th of September. The following day, Supermarine down at Southampton, which is where Spitfires were built at the time, was pretty much completely obliterated. So there were some successes, but it was too late in the day to have any kind of effect. And then, before that, actually, it had suddenly changed from attacking the airfields to bombing London. And these round-the-clock attacks on London from the 7th of September onwards that culminated, in the incredible heavy fighting on the 15th of September when the Germans expected again justified the last Spitfires and the last Hurricanes. And there's something like 350 RAF fighters meet them over the capital. That's amazing, isn't it? Again, that genius of generalship and Air Vice Marshal Park controlled that battle. And Churchill himself was in the ops room at Uxbridge and said to Keith Park, what reserves are there? And he said, there are none, Prime Minister. And on the tote board in front of him, you've got different coloured lights for squadron scrambled, taken off, on patrol, and then enemy sighted and enemy engaged. And every single squadron was in the air and every single squadron's light was red. Every single squadron in 11 Group was engaged with the enemy. That's absolutely amazing. Inspirational stuff. So it is just such a huge story about how the whole thing sort of collapsed, that Goering kept changing tack. It's ironic, really, that von Clausewitz, the great strategist, was German, and they clearly had forgotten his teaching because, they were attacking on this massive broad front. They didn't concentrate their efforts in one place. They didn't concentrate on a plan. They kept changing tack all the time. And then we get to this, the bombing of London, well, that hasn't worked, so we'll do something else now. We'll attack the aircraft industry and we'll attack by night. That was the thing. They were defeated by day by the 30th of September. So then they switched to bombing at night. And if you bomb at night, you're safer because Britain's nocturnal defences were in their infancy. Airborne interception radar was only just coming in and it wasn't very reliable. And the crews were learning how to, work the box of tricks, as they called it. And so we didn't have a dedicated night fighting aircraft. The Blenheim, the Bolton Paul Defiant were being pressed into these roles. But so you could wander around Britain's night skies much safer, but your bombing accuracy is incredibly less because we haven't got at that time, these night vision equipment that you've got for bombing later on in the war. So your safety is traded for lack of accuracy. And that's why, the city bombing began, the Blitz, the night Blitz, as we know it, because you can just rain bombs down, you're going to hit something. down there. Yeah, I've gone off track a bit, I suspect.
Is it fair to say, certain battles, certain campaigns, you might have a bad day, you can recover from it, you keep going. Is it fair to say with the Battle of Britain that if resources had been marshalled badly one day, if we'd put fighters up at the wrong time and had them on the ground, and had to get them on the ground at the wrong time when the Germans stood up, is it fair to say that one bad day in the Battle of Britain at any point could have really been the end of it for us? So there would be no recovering from.
Well, no, because as we've already discussed, the strength was all over the country. So that was the whole point. The Germans did everything. One of the reasons they bombed London was to get Dowding to concentrate his forces to defend London, where our aircraft could then be wiped out en masse over the capital. And they thought the capital was the only target that would make him do that. But of course, he didn't need to, because the defence was totally well organised. There weren't that many aircraft damaged on the ground, really. I mean, the most aircraft I think ever in any war that have been damaged on the ground was actually, I think it was something like it was either the 16th or the 18th of August at night at Brize Norton, where there's like 40 on aircraft or something like that, fighters, but it was a maintenance unit. There wasn't a frontline station, so they didn't achieve a great deal from their attacks on the airfields like that. They certainly rendered some of the airfields temporarily unserviceable, but at no time there was never a problem. I mean, there was never a problem with the resupply of aircraft ever, because of the energies of Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister for Aircraft Production, who was a genius of propaganda, and he was a powerhouse. When he went into the Air Ministry, he literally supercharged the atmosphere. And the story of the Ministry of Aircraft Production is an inspirational story all of its own again. So there was never a shortage of aircraft. What there was a shortage of pilots. And at certain times, particularly early on, a lot of the fighting's over the sea, so pilots being shot down, they're going missing. And I mean, this is the one area where the thing did fall down. Britain is an island nation, so you would assume, logically, that there would have been an effective air-sea rescue service. There wasn't. So pilots who were shot down relied on maybe one or two RAF rescue launches coming out the Thames estuary and down that way, all being picked up by a passing trawler. It was, or if there was a destroyer about. So the air-sea rescue thing was a bit of a disaster, and there were loads of pilots died that I'm sure, had that not been the case, they may have survived. So what you've got is a shortage of pilots on some occasions, but the training units were able to make those losses good. But what those replacements didn't have was any combat experience, and that was so important, because I knew so many survivors, so when I talk, I'm talking through their eyes, really. And so many of them said to me, when you first go up, everything is happening so fast, and you're still really only just coming to terms with flying the bloody thing, and to fly a Spitfire, I remember Kajik Buzik, a Polish pilot, says to me, to fly a Spitfire is one thing, to fly and fight in the Spitfire, that's a different thing all again. I suppose it's a bit like patting the head, isn't it, and rubbing your tummy sort of thing. So, again, there is so much going on here. Amazing. But that was the real problem. What you find is that you've got squadrons in the southeast who have been in action for a week, 2 weeks, whatever. They've suffered possibly 6, 7, 8 pilots killed, and they have to be, a number of aircraft destroyed, damaged. They have to be withdrawn. So they're sent up north to Catterick or Leconfield, for argument's sake, and a squadron from there comes down and replaces them. Time and time and time again, you see those squadrons' numbers, the new squadrons that have never fought the 109 before. They've just been chasing around lone reconnaissance aircraft or nuisance raiders up in the north of England. They're coming down. They got no idea of the difference with these ME 109s. I remember Peter Brown, who was a Spitfire pilot with 41 Squadron, came down from Catterick, and he said the transition between pootling around up north to suddenly all these German fighters everywhere, and everything is moving, closing speeds of 700, 800 mile an hour. He said it was traumatic. They didn't know what they were doing. The Germans knew exactly what they were doing. And their losses were high. And they had to learn very quickly. Take the example of 253 Squadron at Kenley, lost the commanding officer on the first day, Harold Starr, taken over by Tom Gleave, shot down, badly burned, 2 commanding officers within a matter of hours, really. And they had to learn quick. And how many pilots they lost in total, I can't remember now, but, they had to learn quickly. And to see, you had to be able to see, and if that makes sense, because you can look at something, but you don't always see what you're looking at, especially in air combat, because it's moving so fast. And suddenly, to see was to live, they used to say. So I think it's easy when we talk about the Battle of Britain, it's easier to talk about the strategy and the poor intelligence on the German side, and the fact that the Germans kept tacking different directions, with their strategies. But at the end of the day, the air fighting was traumatic. Let's not forget that, And this is fighting 5 miles high. If that's not death-defying enough, and then having somebody shooting at you as well, I mean, God, it's incredible.
So let's talk more about, actually, let's start with the international pilots. You mentioned the Polish ones. How important was the contribution of pilots who had come from outside of Britain?
Well, yeah, because a lot of these guys, they'd seen combat. But I think, again, this can be over-egged, because the Polish pilots, some of them had fought in Poland very briefly. Some of them had then fought with the French Air Force. But the aircraft they had been flying up to that point were obsolete. So they got no experience at all of the RAF state-of-the-art modern fighters, the Hurricane and Spitfire. So they had to learn to fly those first. You see. Now, there's all this nonsense about, Dowding didn't trust them and didn't therefore commit them to the battle as quickly as he could have done. It's rubbish. Nothing to do with that at all. It was because they couldn't speak English. And there were all kinds of initiatives pushed through to help them understand the language, the commands in the air. Woody Woodall, who was the station commander at Duxford in 12 Group, he had a record made with the commands on it and all the lingo that they could play in the pilots' rooms up at Duxford, which was a very clever idea. And that was why, so they had to learn to fly the plane. Then they had to be able to understand the commands in the air. But yes, I mean, there were more Poles than any other nationality, foreign nationality, in the Battle of Britain. And the contribution was essential. I mean, there were 2 Polish squadrons, 302 and 303, and they both did sterling work. I mean, no doubt. The Czechs of 310 Squadron. Then you've got 3 French pilots embedded in RAF squadrons, Dutch, Belgians, from the occupied lands, even American volunteers, probably half a dozen, say, serving in British squadrons. Plus, of course, we got all the men from the Empire and Commonwealth, particularly, who had responded to the appeal in 1936 for short service commissions, that you come and, serve and fly for 3 years, and then you can go off and do something else, but you stay on the reserve. Again, this was all part of the idea that pilots had to be young and fit. So they flew for 3 years and then went on to the reserve. So that was another trained reserve that could be called upon in the event of an emergency. So it's clever stuff.
Obviously, in a battle like this, it's not only the pilots that win it. There's, from the ground crew, radar staff, observers, so I don't want to gloss over that. But who are there any pilots in particular? I'm sure we could spend hours doing a podcast on every single one of them. But who are some of the pilots that really stick out to you after your years of meeting them?
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. But what you've just said is absolutely right. And Dowding always said we were a Battle of Britain team. And I think that's really important that we remember that, because, a lot of these people are very young, 17, 18, 19, pilots as well. The youngest of the few, Martin Oral King, was 18. And there were a lot of them who were 18, actually, and 19. But yes, you've got, huge support staff. Yeah, the first person I ever met who was in the Battle of Britain was a fitter on 66 Squadron, Bob Morris, absolutely brilliant bloke, who told me so much, and his experiences were so interesting. These people are working out on these airfields, out in the open, being bombed, and a long way from shelters and things like that, But let's also just very quickly remember it wasn't just a fighter command battle. Coastal Command were having to protect the convoys, bringing in essential supplies and hunt for U-boats. And they were also carrying out reconnaissance of the invasion ports and attacking the invasion ports, Boulogne, Calais, Ostend, Dunkirk, where the Germans were gathering these big barges that they were going to use to cross the channel. And the same with Bomber Command. Bomber Command, they were doing the same thing. They were attacking the invasion ports, they were attacking enemy airfields, and they were also having to take the war into Germany by night to attack industrial targets. So, this is a big collective effort. But to talk just about pilots, yes, you are right. I did know so many, and I knew them all very, very closely for a lot of years. And the one that I would say is, and I was talking about this somebody the other day, Tim Elkington, John Francis Durham Elkington, known to his family and friends as Tim. Don't ask me why. But Tim was the last of the few who I knew, and Tim died in 2018. Of course, we lost the last of the few earlier this year, Group Captain John Hemingway. So this has been the first anniversary we've had none of the few alive. But I remember Tim was so, like they all were, so modest and couldn't understand what the fuss was about, sort of thing, he was hard work, a lovely, lovely man, but he used to drive his family to distraction because he wouldn't open up and he wouldn't talk about things and he wouldn't accept the adoration, really, of people, I suppose. And I wrote a book 10 years ago called The Final Few, which was about certain of the last survivors who were around at that time, one of whom was Tim. And he got a story to tell. I mean, Tim was 19, I think, in the Battle of Britain, flying Hurricanes with No. 1 Squadron at Northolt and Tangmere. And on the 16th of August, he was shot down over the south coast by Helmut Wick, who was one of the leading German ace at the time, actually. And he bailed out, slightly wounded, and passed out. And as he was descending by parachute, Flight Sergeant Fred Berry used the prop wash off his Hurricane to blow Tim in towards land because he was drifting out to sea. And he actually landed unconscious on the beach at East Wittering. But he was never able to thank Fred Berry because Fred Berry was killed the following week. And Tim was in hospital. And actually, when he was descending by parachute, his mother actually watched him come down because he lived down there. The family were living down there. Isn't that amazing? So she's watching this parachute through binoculars. No idea that it's her son who's just been shot down. But anyway, Yeah, I did the chapter about Tim, and he was like, "Oh, why do you have to reproduce my combat reports?" I said, well, it's what people want to read, isn't it? It's all part of the stuff. Oh, no, he said, I was pilot officer idiot. I didn't know anything. He said, I probably made it all up, which he didn't. And I said, well, it's all in the public domain, Tim. It's going to go in the book. Anyway, he was very happy when the book came out. But the last time I saw him, my son and I went over to have a Sunday roast with the Elkingtons, and I was talking about having recently been and stayed at Bell 2, which is a high-end, unique, quirky bed and breakfast down at Beachy Head in an old lighthouse. And we were talking about that, and Tim suddenly had a faraway look in his eye, and he said, I remember in the Battle of Britain being on patrol, and we came back in flying really low over Beachy Head, and it was a hot day, and they had the cockpit canopy of the Hurricane open, and down below, he says, the yokels were burning stubble in the fields, and you could smell this wood smoke in the Hurricane cockpit. And he said, I looked down there and I thought, and I smelt that wood smoke, and I thought, that's England, that is, and that's worth fighting for. Oh, and I thought that was just fantastic, And when I got home, I put the thing on Facebook, just come back from a great Sunday dinner with Tim Alkinson, blah, 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 and this is what he said, and Tim's daughter, Tess, great friend of mine, she said, oh, look, Dad, Dilip should put this on Facebook. Oh, my God, what's he done that for? Tell him to take that off. Oh, my God, But it was such a fantastic quote, and I wish that I'd got that when I did the book. I think I'm pretty sure I'd probably put it in a book since, but it was just a brilliant thing to say.
I mean, I was having this conversation, and I've had this conversation with many other people. I was having it with a couple of guys last weekend about, all of our grandfathers served in the war. We wish we'd asked them more, but we were also told, don't ask them about the war, and of course, it's a lot easier to remember when we know the stories, because if otherwise it's just this thing that happened in a history book rather than it's thing that happened to that person that you loved in your life, all of their life and all of your life. On that subject of remembrance, can you tell us a bit about the reasons for you writing this new book, and maybe something that you've learned from it that you might not have expected going into the project?
Well, my first book came out 35 years ago, which was about a particular Spitfire squadron in the Battle of Britain and their commander who was killed. So I've been at this game a very long time. I think I've written over 60 books now. So this particular project wasn't just one book, it was 8. It was an official history for the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust, which manages the National Battle of Britain Memorial, the National Memorial to the Few, down on the cliffs above Folkestone there at Cape Fern. So for me, having spent a lifetime, since I was a child, researching this and recording memories and writing all these books, I wanted to put it all together in a chronological narrative that was going to dissect every single combat, every single raid, every single squadron action, everything, but not just fighter command, coastal command, bomber command, the German side, and also the home front. I mean, there's some marvelous things because we've got the Ministry of Information documents. They had these sort of questionnaires, that went round, and people filled them in, and they were all analysed. So the government could keep a track on what the population was thinking. And there's some brilliant stuff there. Like there's one particular really heavy day of fighting in the Battle of Britain, and the report from the Tunbridge Wells Women's Institute was that jam making was going well. Get in. Now, isn't that British? Eh? I mean, stuff like that. It sounds daft, but it's just brilliant. And the ARP, the air raid precaution people, and, all that sort of, put it all together in one thing. So I did. And it's a lifetime's work. It took 2 years to actually write the 8 volumes. And the first volume, The Gathering Storm, looks at all the background to it, and including that period up to the 10th of July. So it's that period of fighting between the 2nd of July to the 10th of July, as well as everything else. And then the next 5 volumes break the battle down into different phases, because it lasted 16 weeks. And then the final one, which Princess Anne very graciously wrote the foreword to, and Claire Horton, who is the Director General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, wrote a postscript to. Volume 8 pulls it all together, Battle of Britain Remembered. And in that, I've looked at how the battle's been commemorated over time, because that has significantly changed from the immediate post-war period, when it's still alive, isn't it, in people. So we had all of those Battle of Britain at home days. All of the stations had an air display or something going on to commemorate the Battle of Britain in September. And we've got lots of memorials. We've got our wonderful Battle of Britain, the National Memorial down at Folkestone, the Battle of Britain London Monument on the embankment at Westminster. There's, absolutely loads of stuff. And the Battle of Britain has been well written about. And I'm particularly interested in the memoirs, the autobiographies that came out during the war, because they were written very much to raise and maintain morale, and how those changed over time when people were writing about things from advanced years and much later, how their perceptions had changed. And the Battle of Britain in film, lots of films, but only one really good one that looked at the whole picture. And that's the 1969 Battle of Britain film, which will never, ever be surpassed, in my opinion, ever. And to look at all the different memorials, museums, and associated sites of interest, to put it all together, and where that's where we are now with the Battle of Britain, if you like. So it was an absolutely huge project, and since I finished it, I have to say, done another 2 books: a Spitfire photo album that I think's out soon, and a book about a particular Spitfire that we excavated 40 years ago, and all the pilots who flew it. Spitfire R644, they'll be out soon. But since finishing it, and I've done a lot of speaking, because obviously it's the 85th anniversary, so I've been doing book signings and speaking and doing lots of pods and this kind of thing that we're doing this evening. But I've managed to do quite a lot of carp fishing on my boat, and that's really what I need to do at the moment.
I honestly take my hat off to you. You should write your next book about how to manage time and be an effective writer.
Well, I tell you, when my first book came out, I think I was 29, and I was a detective then. I was a police officer, and I was a police officer until 2005. And during that time, I'd actually founded a publishing company that I ran concurrently with my police service, all my research writing, young kids, family, and then after leaving the police, I decided to go to university again, and I did some teaching, and then I went into fishing is my other big passion, by the way, pike fishing and carp fishing, and I ended up sort of head of fisheries enforcement nationally, and that was interesting. Did that for 8 years. So I've only actually been writing full time for 5 years. And that's 60 odd books. I don't know how many I've done actually in the last 5 years, but quite a few. But I must have done nearly 50 when I've been doing this alongside full-time jobs. So what I would say, I think the time management thing is really important. If you go on my YouTube channel, I've actually put a few videos on there about, if you want to write a book, this is how I do it, and this is my advice to you, sort of. So there might be some helpful stuff for people on there, but there's one thing I always say to myself, and I've been doing a lot of fishing over the last couple of months, really. Well, since about March, a bit more than a couple of months, and it is difficult to get back into it because I've got 2 books. I need to do some work, to be honest. And I just say to myself, just get on with it. Just get on with it. Book's not going to write itself. Don't overthink it. just get on with it. But the time management thing, that goes back to being a detective. When you've got jobs coming at you from all directions and inquiries, you know, and you can do so much on that job, and then you hit a point where you can't do any more until you're waiting for forensic results or somebody else to be interviewed or whatever. So you leave that one, and then you go on to another one, and you do the same. And then by then you've got another 20 jobs on your desk. So that's how I learned to do it, I think, really. And it doesn't faze me in the slightest, you know.
And where, can you remember, was there almost like that kind of spark moment that started off this?
Oh, yeah, I can. I mean, when I was a kid, growing up in the 1960s, the war was omnipresent then. You know, your neighbours have been in it, your relations have been in it, your teachers have been in the war. Everybody talked about it one way or another. We made model planes, ships, tanks. We ran around with Tommy guns and plastic helmets and goodness knows what. The war films there was a relentless barrage of them, wasn't there? You know, the Dam Busters, 633 Squadron, Battle of Britain, Angels 1-5, goodness me. You know, The Longest Day, and the comics, Commando, Warlord, Victor, Valiant. I bought into all of that, you know. I was a flipping absolute war junkie as a kid. And then when I was about 18, I realised that some of the pilots in the Battle of Britain, because it was always the Battle of Britain, I remember my uncle made model planes, so there was always a Spitfire or a Hurricane around in my life. So the Battle of Britain film came out when I was 8 years old, but I was hooked on it long before that. And the film was also subject to about 18 months of publicity. So there were Battle of Britain cards, bubblegum cards. We used to collect books and things like that. But when I actually saw the film on the big screen, and it was in colour, and they're real aircraft, not models on sticks like in Reach for the Sky, you know, absolutely amazed. It was amazing. But that wasn't the light bulb moment. The light bulb moment was in 1985 when I was sent to work in Malvern. And I bumped into an old friend of mine. And we used to do a little bit of aviation archaeology before I joined the police, where we used to potter about looking for old aircraft crashes, you know, and we'd do a little bit of research and look into them and do a little bit of excavating, but nothing that serious, really, because I didn't have time. I was busy being young, I suppose. And I bumped into Andy Long again. When I was policing the Malvern Three Counties show, bored stiff, I hasten to add. And he said, I said, I've just moved to Malvern. And he said, did you know? He said that there was a Spitfire crash just outside Malvern, engine fire. A Polish Battle of Britain pilot who bailed out, but he was killed and he's missing, reported missing over the channel 6 months later. Ping! That was it. Light bulb moment. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. That's it. Ping, you know, I think I was 24 at the time, and that was it. And that's actually the book that's about to come out, The Invisible Thread, which is all about that Spitfire. We put up a big project to excavate the Spitfire in a big public event. I mean, there wasn't much of it left, to be honest, but it didn't matter. And we built a memorial to the pilot because he was missing, and we thought that it was a good thing to do. And that was unveiled by two Polish Battle of Britain pilots who actually flew with him, Gandhi Drabinski and Ludwik Martel. And at the time, it was the only memorial in this country to an individual Polish fighter pilot. So that was incredible. And that's when I started researching, really deep research into people, because it's the people I'm interested in. You know, I'm not really interested in what kind of carburetor a Spitfire had, to be honest. You know, I'm not technically minded. I do have to know all that stuff as well. But it's the people and their personal experiences. That's what I'm interested in. And researching the story of the aircraft and trying to identify pilots who'd flown it and then write their stories, that brought me into the pilots who survived. But the work had always been underpinned by the stories of casualties. That's what really deeply moved me, particularly the missing. You know, my great-grandfather, my maternal great-grandfather, was missing at Gallipoli in 1915. And I remember talking to my great-grandmother about that when I was 5 years old. because there was a big photo of him that now is in my office on the back wall, actually. And I just couldn't understand how somebody could be missing. So the casualties, researching a casualty, I could then go and talk to pilots who'd flown with that casualty and their families. You were dealing with brothers and sisters in those days, wives, widows, not grandchildren like we are today. You may not even have known the person in life if it was a survivor. So that, and it was just a massive snowball, and it was all about timing, because when I started doing that, the pilots, I mean, I'm 64 now, they were probably not much older than I am now, mid-60s, and they just retired, a lot of them. So after the war, of course, some of them stayed in the service, others went into all kinds of different professions, teaching, banking, business, whatever. And then they've got families to raise, and the war gets put away, doesn't it? Because there are other priorities to deal with, raising families and things like that. And also, it's not like talking about your holidays, which I know from my own policing experience. And I also think there was perhaps a difficulty talking to their own children about it. It skipped a generation, didn't it? That generation, the younger generation, wanted to be off having free love and listening to the Beatles and all that sort of thing, forgetting about austerity and the hard days of the war and what their parents had been through. So it sort of skipped it, really. And then I came along who understood. I understood it, and I knew so much about all the different people, and I could talk. They could talk to me on a level to somebody who understood, and they opened up. I mean, I've got an archive of thousands of letters from Battle of Britain pilots who wrote to me with their experiences, which is in their own handwriting. So it's a unique archive in itself. And it was just the most extraordinary thing that I never anticipated this happening. And it happened because of because a Polish pilot, Franek Surma, happened to bail out of a Spitfire in the most unlikely place of Malvern, Worcestershire. That's why it all came about, really.
Well, I'm sure you don't need thanks, but thank you all the same for doing this work. I'm sure I speak for everyone listening when I say that, particularly the focus on the people. It's one thing to remember. I always said it's the George MacDonald Fraser thing about the maps and the oblongs and different coloured, shapes on a map.
Indeed, yeah.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we remember those if we don't remember who they represented. And I'll let everyone know where they can find all of your sites, your social media, that kind of thing. So I just want to say thank you very much for today. And is there anything that you'd kind of like to say before we part ways for now?
Well, no, just find out a bit about the Battle of Britain and tell your kids. Tell your grandkids. Spread the word. Just don't let people forget. It's too important to forget.